Hey folks, so this is the section that deals with rational functions and graphs. So the first thing to take a look at here is that we have two new parents. First parent is going to be the reciprocal function, and the second new pair is the reciprocal square function. Remember that I've asked you to memorize three different things about each of the parents. One is the name of the parent, so that's the reciprocal function here. One is the equation of the parent, so the equation of the reciprocal function is going to be 1 over x, y equals 1 over x. And then the third thing is going to be the graph. So let's jump right on into getting our graph. If you remember from the other parents that we did, we plugged in a few numbers the first time around so that we could learn what the original shape of the graph was. So if you think about plugging in the number 1 for an x value, 1 divided by 1, you're going to get 1. If I plug in a 2, you have 1 divided by 2 is 1/2, 1 divided by 3 is 1/3. And what you're going to start seeing, 1/4, 1/5, 1/6, 1/100th, 1/1000th, 1/1,000,000th, every single time it gets just a little bit shorter, but it's never actually going to touch the x-axis. And so what we have on that then is going to be something called an asymptote. And that's how you spell that. An asymptote is a place on my graph that I can never actually reach. I keep trying to get closer and closer and closer to it, but I never actually get there. Notice too that if I start plugging in numbers that are between 0 and 1, like the number 1/2, 1 divided by 1/2 gives me 2, 1 divided by 1/3 gives me 3, etc. So not only did I have an asymptote that was horizontal, I also have an asymptote that is vertical. So I have two asymptotes here. And a second comment about why I have a vertical asymptote on the y-axis is simply because remember that you're not allowed to have a 0 on bottom. And an asymptote is like a no man's land. You can get closer and closer to it, but you can't actually reach it. So if I had a 0 on bottom of this parent equation, that would be an undefined place, that no man's land. So let's go ahead then. I've already got my coordinates drawn. Let's go ahead and just connect the dots. And you see I am getting closer and closer and closer to my asymptotes. And then it would be the same thing on the negative side. 1 divided by -1 is -1. 1 divided by -2 is -1/2, -1/3, etc., etc. All right, domain and range you guys are familiar with. We have done that since the very first chapter of the semester, so no big deal here. Remember that an asymptote is no man's land, so you have to skip over it in the domain as well. So that's why it's not just all real numbers. The range, very similar to that, from the bottom to the top. Skip over the horizontal asymptote. If we're looking at increasing, decreasing, and constant, as you read your graph from left to right, you'll notice that it's always decreasing. And what we find is that it is, sorry about that, I erased a little bit too much. What we find out about that is that it's decreasing over the entire domain. The vertical asymptote I've already mentioned, it is on the y-axis, but the other way to say that is that it's the equation x equals 0, and the horizontal asymptote is the equation y equals 0. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the reciprocal square function. Notice that the equation for this one is 1 over x squared. So once again, if you'll pause the video and take some time to plug in some numbers, plug in an x equals 1, an x equals 2, an x equals 3. And then also plug in numbers between 0 and 1. So plug in a 1/2 for x, plug in a 1/3 for x, and see what you find. The right side of my graph, my parent, actually looks very similar to the last parent. As well, I have my vertical asymptote and my horizontal asymptote for both of those. And then what you find here is the left side is different. When you plug in a -1, notice that in your parent equation you have to square that -1. And so when you square that number, you're going to end up with a positive. So everything on the left side ends up being a positive y value. Again, going back to the domain and the range. Domain is the same thing as it was for the reciprocal function. The range is a little different because you have nothing down here on the bottom of the graph. So you're just starting with 0 and working your way up from there. For increasing, decreasing, and constant, this as well is different. If you read it from left to right, the first thing that happens is that it's increasing. And then the second thing that happens is that it's decreasing. Your vertical asymptote and your horizontal asymptote ends up being the same thing.